Latimer City Expats Club is a non-profit social organisation and our speakers are volunteers. The club as such assumes no responsibility or liability for the professional reputation of or the quality of services provided by the speaker today.
Thanks very much, Ren, for the introduction. I will try not to disappoint, and I'm going to talk to you this morning about my service career briefly, so you'll get a potted history on that, just to put into context who I am and what I did. I'm going to relate an incident that happened during the Falklands conflict, which I hope you'll find interesting. I'm going to try and link it in then to the history of the poppy, and as we're in the middle of poppy appeal at the moment, starts mid to late October through till the middle of November, and then I'm going to try and link that also to Remembrance Service. So there's a little bit of everything in there. Now, I'm going to try and juggle microphone, clicker and notes, so bear with me when they all fall on the floor, okay? Okay, that handsome gentleman on the screen there is my dad. And he was a merchant seaman, cook, and before World War II. And when the war broke out, he joined the Royal Navy. Lucky chap that he was. He spent the last 2 years of the war teaching Wrens how to cook at Billy Butlin's holiday camp in Scotland. So he had a wonderful time, or so I'm led to believe. He never used to talk about it. He was actually my primary motivation for joining the Navy. Well, that, and I hope to see the world, and apparently all the nice girls love a sailor. And some of the not so nice girls love sailors as well, so that was a bit of a bonus. So in February 1971, oh, shock horror, you're all going, that can't be that long ago, you look so young, Roy. But yes, 53 years ago, I walked through the gates of HMS Raleigh to start my naval training. And yeah, believe it or not, that is me. And it's hard to believe it was that long ago that chubby, fresh-faced young sailor of 16 and a half years old started a naval career. I actually enjoyed basic training. It suited me really well, and my dad had prepared me for it and explained what was going to happen, you know, the reasons for it, to weed out the chaff, to instill personal discipline, respect, self-respect, forming bonds as a team, etc. And that stood me in good stead, not only through my service career, but also through my personal life. And it's one of those things that, unless you've been in the service, you don't realize the hidden benefits that you get from your service. There are a lot of things that carry you forward in life which you wouldn't have had necessarily. And I'm ever so grateful for it. And when I became an instructor later in my service career, I actually hopefully imparted some of that to my students as well. So the tub of lard who had joined the Navy all of a sudden became settle down ladies, I know, handsome chap on the screen there. But what happened? Okay, the ravages of time. It's terrible, isn't it? 1987, handsome, fit young man, ready to go, ready to face anything. I've been selected for airframes and engines training, or airframe and engines mechanic in the Fleet Air Arm. And so I went on to HMS Daedalus, or the Royal Naval Air Station at Lyon-Solent, as it's referred to as well. And on completion of my trade training, I then went on to HMS Seahawk, which is RNAS, or Royal Naval Air Station Cold Rose, down in Cornwall, one of the busiest helicopter stations in Europe, and still is, as far as I understand, or as far as I believe. So as a junior naval air mechanic, because I was still only 17 at the time, I started work on the Naval Aircraft Support Unit, which was a deep maintenance unit, bringing aircraft back up to scratch. And I was qualified to maintain multiple types of aircraft. The Whirlwind 7, my God, that's going back a bit. The Hiller, which was used for pilot training. And the Wessex 1, Wessex Mark 1, that is. As I turned 18, I was asked to cross-train to the safety equipment branch. And they were desperately short of people in that branch, so for 2 wonderful years, I was working at Coldrose, repairing, maintaining flight clothing, life rafts, life jackets, etc., etc. And that was my first introduction, if you like, to the godlike aircrew who flew in the aeroplanes. I was then returned to my parent trade of airframes and engines mechanic and drafted to Royal Naval Air Station Portland. That's down in Dorset, near Weymouth, and HMS Osprey to give it its ship's title. I then joined HMS Hampshire, which is a destroyer light guided. Okay, they call it light guided because of the missile system on the back, which was totally ineffective. I can say that now, not breaking any secrets. And they carried a Wessex 3 anti-submarine helicopter on the back. Now, if you look at just in front and to the left-hand side of the helo, that's the hangar on the back there. Now, the hangar was just wide enough to get the aeroplane in, and you had to steer it around the side of the hangar between the ship's edge and the hangar doors to actually maneuver it into the space. Now, you try and do that in a Force 8, Force 9 gale. Crikey, there was some days we had then. Lovely ship, enjoyed it. That's me again on the flight, and I was there for about 2 years, had a wonderful time, went to some lovely places, met some wonderful people. Returning to Portland, I realized that I was more interested in actually flying in the aeroplanes than I was in maintaining them. So I applied for and I passed the aircrew selection tests, and I was accepted then for basic flying training. The aircrew selection and training was very intense, and that was my course. And the guy in the front row there, John Pooley, with a puppet Wilf. I'm not sure many of you would have seen, there was a TV program on English TV about HMS Ark Royal, and John used to do a CCTV program on the ship with a little puppet, and he used to get away with murder. He'd take the mickey out of the captain and everybody else, but because the puppet was doing it, he actually got away with it. So, and aircrew training was quite intense. I think out of that course of 9 of us, only 3 of us actually passed. So it was designed to try and get the best out of people. So as a fully fledged air crewman, as my title was there, or leading air crewman as I was at the time, I was drafted to this wonderful vessel, and HMS Brighton. And I from that picture, I don't think there's anything more stirring than a frigate at full bore doing a handbrake turn. I think that's just a very emotive picture. This was now 1978, and I was 24 years old. And having qualified as a Wasp missile aimer, the aircraft on the ship was a Wasp aircraft, my specialization role, as well as general aviation duties, was to fire and guide the SS-11 and AS-12 missiles.
At sea off Portland, the Royal Navy put on a show to demonstrate just one facet of its strike power. A Wasp helicopter approached the frigate HMS Plymouth to make a perfect touchdown. The copter and the missile it was to carry and launch are part of the current defense policy for the Navy of the 70s. The missile is an AS-12 wire-guided type. The helicopter is unique in that it is currently the only manned machine of its kind in the world designed to operate from platforms on small ships in all weathers. Together, missile and copter make a formidable unit. In flight, the missile aimer, seated in the co-pilot's position, used special sights to home on the small target towed by the frigate at speed. A variety of warheads are available for the AS-12. This one was low power. It could have been a submarine or a surface craft.
Very, very old weapon system, and they were wire guided, so effectively when the missile left the aircraft, there was a big spool of wire on the back of it, copper wire, that used to unspool, was still attached to the aeroplane, and you couldn't actually guide them for about 11 seconds, something like that, and the range was about 3,500 yards for an SS-11 and about 6,500 yards for an AS-12. So the first 10 seconds was a bit of a nightmare when you were trying to work out whether you'd actually got control of the missile or not. And then obviously once the missile had struck the target, you would have to cut the wires. So you had 6,000 yards of this copper wire dangling outside around a helicopter with rotating blades. It was, you know, good fun, I think is probably a good expression for it. At the end of my WASP flight, I was sent to Portland again, and I was engaged on a search and rescue squadron, 772 squadron. And we also did ship-to-shore transfers for the ships passing by Portland on exercises, etc. At about that time, I put in my a request for my heart's desire, which was to be a jungly air crewman. Now, the Commando Logistics Support, or Junglies as we used to call them, were formed in around the Borneo and Suez crisis. And what they did was they supported army units, primarily Royal Marines initially, but then any army unit on the ground, whatever they needed. So we would fly them off the ships, we would resupply them, we would move tanks, Land Rovers, etc., etc. So it was probably the best flying that I've ever done in my career. So after completing the operational training at RNAS Yeovilton in Somerset, I was then drafted to 845 Squadron. And just a note, in the photograph there, I wasn't actually leaning on something. The week before I'd sprained my ankle in a training exercise, so I was just trying to keep the weight off my leg. And sadly, two of the guys in that photograph are no longer with us. So a little bit more on that later on. So throughout 1980 and 82, I served on 845 Naval Air Squadron, and our flight, Sea Flight, were based in Northern Ireland, and we used to do 12-week rotations at Royal Air Force Aldergrove, and then we'd fly into Armagh and Bessbrook Mill and basically anywhere in the province, again supporting the armed forces on the ground. What people don't realise is, from that period, that every news report referred to Army helicopters. And the reason for that was that they didn't want to give the IRA the option of hitting Navy or RAF targets. So they just called it Army aircraft so that the IRA didn't have an excuse, if you like, for targeting the other services. I mean, not many people, I think, either realise how big a presence the RN had in Northern Ireland. There were several minesweepers based over there, the Naval Air Squadrons, etc. A lot of Navy personnel supporting the Army there. It was, again, a very interesting period in my naval career. I'm going to skip a couple of years and come back to 1982 in a minute, or in 5 or 10 minutes. In 1984, I was drafted back to Royal Naval Air Station Coldrose as an instructor. And there I am, pictured with some of the other instructors and some of our courses. And you'll see Royal Marines in that picture there. Around that time, we were cross-training Royal Marines to become air crewmen on the Commando Logistics Squadron. Made sense. In 1987, I was retrained to anti-submarine warfare. Not my favourite experience, not my favourite flying job, and pictured there is a Sea King Mark V with the submersible sonar unit either halfway up or halfway down. It's impossible to tell. But we used to dangle that thing into the water and then ping for submarines. But also it was fitted with passive sonar equipment as well. And we used to throw loads of sonar buoys out into the ocean, and then we'd sit at this table in the back, very uncomfortable, and try and discern whether the noises in the water were submarines, whales, or whatever it happened to be. 9 times out of 10 they were trawlers or some other form of shipping. In 1989, I asked my boss if I could then transfer to communications training. Now, the communications in this case is flying right-hand seat in a Jetstream T3 passenger aircraft. And I was based in Yeovilton at the VIP flight and did that for 3 years. Absolutely fantastic, swanning around Europe, taking VIPs wherever they wanted to go, having a wonderful time, all at the Queen's expense. So it's like flying a mini airliner around. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Sadly though, it was all about to come to an end, because my options in the service looking forward would have been unlikely to get back to a jungly squadron, which was my favourite choice. I'd probably end up back on an ASW squadron, which wasn't my cup of tea, or I'd be back on the desk at an instructing job. So in 1993, after achieving WASP aiming, search and rescue, jungly instructor, anti-submarine warfare, and comm specializations, I put in my notice and was given redundancy. And that took me that was about 23 years, just over. And that covered 17 years of naval aviation, and I amassed around about 6,500 flying hours in that time. Okay, so let's go back to 1982. Now, this is not for sympathy or anything like that. I will say that it's only recently that I've actually been able to talk about this. And when Ren asked me to come and do a talk about my service and myself, I don't really feel comfortable doing that. That's why the service bit is a potted history there. But I've recently managed to start talking about the incident that occurred down in the Falklands. And basically, to put it in context, I crashed twice within the space of an hour in 2 separate aeroplanes. Careless, I know. I shouldn't have done it. It wasn't my fault. I wasn't the pilot at the time. Every year in February, early March, or January, February, early March, 845 Squadron, along with a lot of other squadrons, would take part in Operation Clockwork, which was an Arctic training exercise. And we used to do that at Bardufoss, way up in northern Norway, inside the Arctic Circle. And the idea was to get us trained up to operate in freezing cold conditions in the Arctic. It was absolutely fantastic. Again, loved it, brilliant experience. But operating helicopters in those sorts of temperatures and snow, etc., is not the perfect thing. I was actually the maps and charts man for the squadron, and it was my job to make sure we had coverage of wherever the squadron needed to go. And in late March 1982, my boss, the squadron boss, asked me if we had any coverage of the Falkland Islands. And I honestly remember saying to him, I'm pretty sure we've got coverage of all the Scottish Islands, boss. He said, no, laddie, wrong way. So, myself and my friend, Jan Lomas, who is pictured here at his 60th birthday in the Royal Naval, in the Fleet Air Arm Museum at RNAC Overton, which was a great do, by the way. We hopped in the car and we went to the Maps and Charts depot, and we got as many charts of the Falklands and maps of the Falklands as we could. In early April 1982, our flight commander, Lieutenant Mike Tidd, called the whole of Sea Flight together. He told us our flight was to lead the way for the squadron. So the 2 aircraft of the flight, Wessex 5s, were stripped down and packed into a US Air Force Starlifter and flown down to Ascension Island. All of us, crew and maintainers, etc., were loaded on board RAF VC-10s and also flown down to the Ascension Island. Ascension Island's a wonderful place. I don't know if anybody's been here. Has anybody actually been? Brilliant place. I love it. It's one of my favorite places in the world. It was one of those islands. It's a volcanic island, and it was basically untouched for hundreds and thousands of years until the explorers and Darwin and people like that used to touch base in there. And of course, a lot of the specimens and animals that Darwin had on board were released into the local environment. So at the base level, Ascension Island is basically a lava beach, lava covering. But as you go up the central mountain, it turns from that into beautiful desert scrubland, and then you go up a little bit further, there's actually pasture, green pastures and a dairy farm halfway up. And then when you get to the top, there's a tropical paradise up there. It's an amazing place. Having reassembled both aeroplanes, we then embarked on the Royal Fleet Auxiliary Tide Spring, which was a RFA tanker, and a big hangar on the back there, lovely, nice big flight deck. So our 2 aeroplanes, our flight, and various other troops were loaded on board. And then we joined a small task group, and that task group was CTG 317.9. And that consisted of HMS Antrim, which was a DLG, the same as the Hampshire that I was on. And they were equipped with a Wessex 3 aircraft. Royal Fleet Auxiliary Tide Spring with our 2 Wessex 5s. HMS Plymouth, a frigate which had a Wasp on board. HMS Endurance, which was the Antarctic survey ship, and they also had a Wasp on board. And apparently HMS Conqueror, a submarine, was lurking about somewhere, but I honestly never saw it the whole time. So our destination...
Over 6,000 feet, with majestic glaciers spanning the gaps.
One of the first operations of the Falklands was Operation Paraquet, or Operation Paraquat, as we later dubbed it, because it turned into one of the most toxic messes that you could imagine. South Georgia had been occupied by a force of around about 150, don't quote me on the numbers, largely conscripted soldiers, and there was a small force of Argentinian special forces, or as I like to call them, thugs, because they were not nice people. And their submarine, the Santa Fe, was also operating in the area. On South Georgia at the time, there were Argentinian and British civilians from survey expeditions, etc., etc., and the Argentinians had a lot of scrap metal dealers there, or scrap metal merchants there, who were trying to recover some of the whaling station stuff and recycle it. D Squadron 22 SAS, and my colleague over there knows a little bit about them, were transferred during the transit from Royal Fleet Auxiliary Fort Austin. It was later established that this was without the knowledge of the colonel in charge of the land forces for our task group, or indeed the task group commander. And that was a Captain Young of HMS Antrim. And on the 21st of April, the plan was to undertake surveillance of the Argentinian forces on the island in Leith, Grytviken and other small outposts in preparation for a liberation assault. The officer commanding D Squadron SAS was tasked with observations on Leith and ordered by the Commander Land Forces to put forward a plan. Now please understand, I have the utmost respect, nothing but respect for the wonderful SAS regiment, and in particular the soldiers of D Squadron. I will, however, state that the plan that was proposed by their boss for the insertion of members of D Squadron was ill-conceived, reckless, and completely unnecessary. It was one of those plans that you stood there and wondered how they'd come up with it. It was challenged very strongly at the briefing, and it was also challenged formally by the Commander of Land Forces, Lieutenant Colonel Sheridan, Royal Marines. Basically, the plan was to insert the SAS up the Fortuna Glacier. You can see the red line there. To get them as high up there as you could. They were then going to scale the mountains, walk the glacier, descend the other side, and end up at Leith, 15 kilometers away. Sounds feasible. This is an extract from Colonel Sheridan's report that he made public later on. Basically, he said, I advised Captain Young in private not to authorize the SAS plan to land on the Fortuna Glacier for the following reasons. The southern winter had already established itself, and it was quite fierce that year, if I remember rightly. High on a glaciated plateau was not the place for helicopter operations, and I concur with that. The SAS troop had no experience of either the terrain or subarctic conditions. They were mountain trained, but they weren't trained to operate in -10, -15 degree temperatures, or worse. He was overruled, and the Fortuna plan was duly authorized by the Commander Task Group. So that was that. Objections noted, and off we go. Some points to note. The Wessex 5 is basically an airborne van. Okay? It's designed to load troops in, stores, equipment, etc., and take it from A to B. That's what a Wessex 5 aircraft is, an airborne van. It's got pretty basic flight instruments, and all navigation was done by the navigation aide, i.e. the air crewman, sitting in the back. The Wessex 3 was primarily an airborne anti-submarine weapon, but they were equipped with radar, submersible sonar, and some instruments which enabled them to hover over a moving sea to keep the sonar stable in the water. Both the Wessex 3s and 5s were over 18 years old at the time of the Falklands, so they weren't young aeroplanes. The Wessex 3 only has one engine, and the Wessex 5s have two engines.
Three helicopters head for the glacier. Most of the troops go in two Wessex troop carriers, each with ample room for fully kitted soldiers. Humphrey takes the lead, acting as the mission's pathfinder. Instead of troops, the bulk of
the other aircraft on our flight, Sub-Lieutenant Andy Berryman and Flight Lieutenant Andy Pulford, Royal Air Force, who notably went on to become Chief Air Vice Marshal Andy Pulford, so he did well for himself, were not involved in the operation, and that was simply due to weight restrictions on the aircraft. We flew one pilot, one air crewman due to the fuel weight ratio. We needed to try and pack in as much fuel as we could, basically. The Wessex 5's Yankee Foxtrot was piloted by Lieutenant Mike Tidd, our flight commander, and myself, the air crewman. Yankee Alpha, the other Wessex 5 aircraft, was piloted by Lieutenant Ian Georgeson, and my good buddy Jan Lomas was the air crewman. Humphrey, the Wessex 3, was piloted by Lieutenant Commander Ian Stanley, and more on him later. Lieutenant Chris Parry, who was the observer and radar operator, and again went on to become a Rear Admiral. Sub-Lieutenant Stuart Cooper, who was second pilot, and Petty Officer Air Crewman Dave Fitzgerald, who was the air crewman on the flight.
a Westland Wessex 3, affectionately known as Humphrey. 19 years old even then, it's now housed in the Navy's Fleet Air Arm Museum. But Humphrey is a much-loved old workhorse. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander Ian Stanley.
And you get to that age.
There are a couple of things that people don't appreciate about the conditions down on South Georgia. Firstly, the wind was unpredictable. It could go from a benign, steady 20 to 30 knots to a swirling, howling gale of gusts to over 100 knots in the space of a second. Secondly, the white stuff on the glacier is not snow as you know it from your ski resorts, the white fluffy stuff. It's actually crystalline ice particles. And the wind picks these particles up and just swirls them around. So a bit like being in a snow globe. Basically, the world becomes opaque. And the third big problem is something called katabatic winds. Conditions on the approach and up on the glacier itself were absolutely fearsome.
You can't see. It's like being in the dark, but it's white.
Please bear in mind that the evolution that we're talking about now didn't happen first time, okay? We spent 3-4 hours trying to get up onto the glacier in the first place. We refueled probably 4 times, I think, back on the ship, trying to attempt to get up there to get these guys where they wanted to be. Okay, so you're talking about a repeated exercise to try and get this complete. The Wessex 3 was absolutely crucial to the operation because of their flight instruments and radar. If we hadn't had the Wessex 3 there, we probably would have refused to undertake it.
What we're being...
Throughout the whole of the transit, basically the 2 Wessex 5s were formating on the Wessex 3. So Humphrey would be doing his thing, and then the 2 Wessex 5s would formate using him as a visual reference. Pretty skilled flying from both of the Wessex 5 pilots, from all the pilots engaged. We eventually made it up to the insertion point. And having dropped off the troopers, we basically got the hell out of Dodge. And this was on the 21st of April. Forgot to mention that earlier. Then we went. We wanted to get down from there as soon as we possibly could.
That was the job done as far as we were concerned. We were very happy to get off the glacier and very happy to get back to the ship.
So, phew, that's over. All good and dusted. Back to the ship for a cup of tea. Lovely. So, the tactical insert was achieved. Part 2 of the operation quickly turned into a search and rescue job. After a very short time, the weather stopped the Special Forces guys in their tracks. Frostbite exposure became a concern, and they'd actually made only a few hundred yards, 500 yards, half a mile, half a kilometre, something like that. And we'd been on standby all night, myself and Jan taking turns and the pilots taking turns to sleep, because we actually thought we were going to get a call a bit earlier and have to go back and pick them up. But I think it was around about 9, 10 o'clock in the morning of the 22nd. Again, don't quote me on that because the memory's a bit hazy sometimes. Antrim received a distress call from the troopers. They'd managed to get their HF radio up and running and managed to get some communication with the ship. So what started as a tactical insert had rapidly turned into a search and rescue mission. Once again, it was no easy task getting back up there. I mean, again, I think we took several hours of attempts to actually get back up to the glacier. And when we did get up there, the glacial plateau looked like an alpine postcard. It was amazing. For some reason, the winds had died down. We could see for miles. It was pristine white, beautiful blue skies, no clouds. So we thought, wow, this is okay. We're going to get away with this one. The troops, as I said, have only made about half a mile from where we dropped them off. And as we turned into wind to land, I opened the back door fully. And one of the reasons became apparent why they hadn't got very far, because clearly visible beneath the white crystalline overtop was the glaciers, the crevasses, sorry. Now these crevasses are 200, 300, 400 feet deep, and they're probably, I don't know, range between 5 yards wide, and some of them are 50 yards wide. So the only way these guys could get across them would be to go around and find a way around. And even as we landed, the wind started to pick up again. Yeah, Mike said unload troops there, but at this stage we were actually reloading them. Excuse me. We had landed first in our Wessex 5, and the troops staggered towards us from where they'd been sheltering overnight, and we only found out later that they'd actually fastened themselves inside one of the crevasses to get out of the wind. Their tents had been blown away immediately, their shelter had gone, and they pitoned themselves about 3 or 4 feet down inside the crevasse just to get out of the ferocious winds. Even dressed in Arctic clothing, some were showing early signs of hypothermia, and the sooner we got out of there and back to the ship, the better. Each stick also had a pulk sled, which they loaded all their heavier equipment on, and they would use to drag it to wherever they needed to go. Nearby, the other 2 helicopters had landed and were loading the troops. I got our stick and their kit in as quickly as I possibly could and offered them hot soup from flasks we had in the back. Mike Tidd called down to me over the intercom and said, "I'd like to get out of here as quickly as possible. Let me know when you're ready." I said, "About 30 seconds, boss." During that time, he called Ian Stanley in the Wessex 3, who was the senior officer of the operation, and asked permission if we could go. Basically, we could see where we needed to go. It was clearly visible about 2 or 3 kilometers away, and then we could see the descent of the slope going down. So he was given permission, and we got airborne. We climbed to about 150 feet, I would think, and got up to about 60 to 80 knots. I hadn't gone far when Mike calmly called down to me, "Can you have a look outside? Because I can't really see much at the moment." So I opened the door and I looked out, I got outside on the step, and I couldn't see a thing. Absolutely couldn't see a thing. The wind had come up, the ice crystals were blown about, etc. And I actually, at that point, I was pretty lucky because I turned back inside the airplane to grab a smoke grenade off the nearest trooper, and what I was going to do was pop the pin and throw it out the door, and hopefully then we would have some sort of smoke reference on the ground that we could hover alongside. We'd slowed to about 30 knots, I guess, at that point. It's hard to tell. And the tail hit the ground. What we didn't know was that the ground on the left-hand side was sloping upwards because we couldn't see it. So we hit the ground tail first, and then the main blades hit the ground, and it all went horribly wrong, as they say. We skidded for about 50 yards before coming to a stop. And fortunately, I'd locked all the troops in to their seats and strapped the polk in as tight as I could. Otherwise, we'd have had loose bodies flying around all over the place.
And
that was the result. And sorry about the grainy photograph, but the cameras at the time weren't brilliant. As you can see, it's lying port side down, and it was in a hell of a mess. There were blades and bits and pieces all over the place. The tail section of the aircraft was probably about 40 yards behind us, maybe 40, 50 yards behind us. At the time, I was wearing what we called a dispatcher harness, which was like a canvas belt you wrap around your middle with a 2-meter tail with a hook on the end that you used to hook into one of the ring bolts in the back of the aeroplane. Now, it was designed so you could move around in the aeroplane and not fall out. If you got a sudden jolt or turbulence or whatever, at least you wouldn't completely depart the aeroplane. But it gave you no protection, if you like, for crashing. I was lucky. If I hadn't turned into the cabin at that time, I think I would have been dragged along underneath the aeroplane. So there we go. I think I should buy a lottery ticket sometime soon. On impact, I was physically thrown into the forward bulkhead of the cabin. And the thing that sticks in my head, and this is an intended pun, we had a door-mounted general-purpose machine gun in the aircraft, and the barrel of that was sticking up the side of my helmet between the padding and my cheek, and I've no idea why. I never received a mark. There was no scratch, there was nothing. It was amazing. So I managed to get that out, and then we got the troops out, and etc., etc. At that point, fuel was pouring out of the aeroplane, the engines were still hot, so I was a bit worried that something might go bang. And we clambered down to the ground and looked around, and as if by magic again, completely blue sky. The wind had dropped, and the ice crystals had settled down, and we could see the other 2 aeroplanes sitting on the ground. And they'd seen what had happened to us. And there's the other Wessex 5 who'd made their way over to us when we crashed. When they landed either side of us, Jan Lomas, my buddy, ran over to me to see if we were okay, and miraculously there were no serious injuries at all. There were cuts, bruises, abrasions, stiff necks, whatever, but nobody broken anything, etc. So no time to chat. We divided up the troopers into the different helicopters, and that's where my luck turned bad, because being a jungly crewman through and through, I decided to get into the Wessex 5 with my buddy Jan, and Mike Tidd, the pilot, decided to get into the Wessex 3. He always was a smart cookie, Mike Tidd. Loaded, we had 15 on board, I think, if I remember rightly. And we lifted off and we followed Humphrey, the Wessex 3. And at that particular point, conditions were comparatively good. Basically in Georgetown again, stayed 2 or 3 rotor spans behind the Wessex 3. And the Wessex 3, as I mentioned, is an anti-submarine warfare helicopter, and that meant it had to hover over the sea, and the sea was moving, obviously, as it does. So it had this thing called Doppler hover. And basically you would plug the Doppler hover in, and it would adjust the sideways movement of the aircraft to keep it stationary above the sonar. Great bit of kit. So basically what would happen is if the conditions got hairy or he was side slipping, he'd push in the Doppler hover, and then the aircraft would come into a nice hover, and our Wessex 5 would be able to hover alongside him. No problem. Wessex 5s didn't have that. And it was a great plan, it was working. Then it all went horribly wrong. Humphrey was slowing, and he was slowly continuing forward, so as well as in the hover he would just transition forward and keep the forward momentum on. And then at some point he basically disappeared. So if this is the edge of the glacier, he disappeared down here. Wessex 5 is here, can't see anything anymore. So his reference has gone over there. Another cracking pilot, Ian Georgeson, can't praise him enough. He'd managed to reduce the speed again and was desperately trying to find any sort of visual clue. Jan again had opened the door, and he was trying to find some sort of reference outside, but he didn't have time. We hit the mountain again, and this time hit starboard front first. And we skidded to a stop again about 50 meters away. Very, very close to a crevasse at this particular point. By a miracle, again, nobody was seriously injured. All the troops in the back, cuts and bruises again, bruised egos, but nothing broken, nothing serious. The engines were running down at this time, and the only way out was through the bubble hatches because we'd landed right side down, covering the door. Jan and I got out and started getting the troops out, and then we realized now we're in a survival situation. Humphrey was the only helicopter left, and I will repeat, it was an anti-submarine warfare helicopter not designed to pack troops in. He'd gone back to the ship, and we hoped, against hope, that he'd made it back to the ship, because if he hadn't, then the chances of us getting off the glacier were almost nil. Knowing that those guys would move heaven and earth to get back, but also knowing realistically they would not get back for a while, we weighed up the options. Walking off the glacier was a no-go. There was not a chance we were going to manage that. So basically we hunkered down and got ourselves into a survival situation. Now in the aeroplanes we had 10-man life rafts. Each aircraft had one, and they were CO2 bottle operated, so you'd pull the string, the life raft would inflate. So we did that, and we got the worst cases of hypothermia into the life raft, which helped because all the bodies were weighing it down, stopping it blowing around. Once again, the wind dropped again. Just it happens there, 1 minute it's blowing a gale, next minute it's benign. And we looked over, and about half a mile away I could see my aeroplane lying on the ground. So Jan and I had a conversation with Ian and said, look, what about if we walk over there and we go and get all the kit from there, the other life raft, etc. We might need it. Now Jan and I were both wearing what we call immersion suits. Now these are, you might have seen them, they're like waterproof suits with rubber seals at the wrist, the neck, big waterproof zip that comes down, and they've even got waterproof socks on them that you put your boots on over the top. Walking on a flat level surface for any distance is uncomfortable in them. Walking over that terrain in these things was damn near impossible, but we wanted to go and do it. About 3 or 4 of the troopers came with us, and when we got to the aeroplane, we loaded as much stuff as we could on the Polk. You saw the photograph earlier. And then we headed back to the second crash site. Now, I'll never forget this. It's ingrained in my memory. On the back of the Polk, there was about a 2-meter length of rope. And Jan and I were waddling along in our immersion suits, trying to keep up with the Polk. And then the weather closed in again. It started to come down. I tell you what, I broke all personal records keeping up with that bit of string, because I knew if I'd lost sight of the bit of string, that might be the end of it. And of course, being SAS troopers, they put a spurt on and they were going hell for leather. I remember shouting, "For Christ's sake, slow down, we can't keep up." By the time we got back, Ian Georgeson had organised a brew, and we set up the other life raft, and then we decided to settle in for the long haul. We did have time to take some photos though, and that's myself and Jan sat on the side of the aeroplane, and as you can see on the nose section, the big gash, that's where the rotor blades dug into the front of the nose. We'd managed to speak to Antrim, so they knew we were still okay, but it looked like we were going to be spending the night on the glacier. And the maintainers had stripped Humphrey to the bones. All that was in the back was the radar and an instrument repeater panel above the radar position and the seat for the observer. Obviously, he needed that to operate it. So we were in the back of the aeroplane, 16 of us, I think, designed for, as was said, a 4-person aeroplane, sitting 4 abreast across the back on the floor. There were no seats, no straps, no nothing. Okay? And unfortunately, because the instrument repeater panel was up above the radar, I could see it, so could Jan. And on the instrument panel was an airspeed indicator and the radar altimeter. Fitz, the air crewman in the back of the Wessex 3, our good buddy, we could see he was as concerned as we were. During the whole of the previous events, I don't remember being scared. Anxious, yes, a host of other emotions, but I was too busy to be scared. Now I had nothing to do but sit in the back of the aeroplane, looking at those instruments and thinking, this is not good. Landing back on a heaving deck in the South Atlantic at dusk in a seriously overcrowded and overweight aircraft, it was a one-time thing. We weren't going to get a go-around. We knew beyond any shadow of a doubt if we ditched, the likelihood would be none of us would get out. And if we did, life expectancy in the water was about 4 minutes, even though we had immersion suits. The troopers didn't. I've got to be honest, that's the most terrified I've been in my whole life. And I kid you not, we must have hit the deck doing, well, I can't imagine how heavy we hit the deck. I'm pretty sure we busted the oleos or the undercarriage on the aircraft. It was a slam it down, get the lashings on, shut the engines down, and get out of the way. And silent tears were running down my cheeks at that time. And when I got out of the aircraft, Mike Tidd was on the deck waiting to welcome us all back. And he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, yeah, it's just the wind, Mike. It's got in my eyes. Don't worry about it. I owe a debt of gratitude to the courage and comradeship shown by my fellow aviators, particularly Jan Lomas, who was a great support during that time, and is sadly no longer with us. He died 3 or 4 years ago of Huntington's disease, which is a absolutely awful, debilitating disease. I owe my life to the supreme piloting skills of Ian Stanley, Mike Tidd and Ian Georgeson. and the crew of Humphrey. Without their professionalism, dedication and courage, I know I wouldn't be here today. They say you should never meet your heroes. Well, I disagree with that. I met mine, Lieutenant Commander Ian Stanley, and without doubt he is my personal hero and an absolute gentleman. It would have been so nice to get back into the rhythm of normal life after that, but for the next few months, sadly that wasn't the case. Life was never actually normal after it, but that, they say, is another story. The poppy. Thank you. A couple of minutes. Thank you, Ren. Bear with me, it won't be long now. Okay. The poppy is an enduring symbol of remembrance. It's stemmed from the First World War and strongly linked with Armistice Day, the 11th of November. And the poppy's origin as a popular symbol of remembrance lies in the landscapes of the First World War. In 2014, 800,000 ceramic poppies were displayed at the Tower of London. Then a large part of those went on a tour throughout Great Britain. It was actually the shelling and churning up of the ground and soil on the Western Front which produced the ideal growing conditions for the poppies. They inspired the Canadian Army Dr. John McCrae, while serving in Ypres in 1915, to write his poem In Flanders Fields. In response to McCrae's poem, American humanitarian Moyna Michael wrote, "And now the torch and poppy red we wear in honour of our dead." Servicemen would enclose poppies in their letters home, and several examples of desiccated poppies can be seen in the Imperial War Museum. Artificial poppies were first sold in Britain in 1921 to raise money for the Earl Haig Fund, as it was then. Selling poppies proved so popular that in 1922 the British Legion founded its own factory and employed ex-servicemen and disabled service people to make the poppies. Other charities sell poppies in different colours, all to commemorate the losses of war. White poppies, for example, symbolise peace without violence, and purple poppies are worn to honour animals which are killed in conflict. The poppy continues to be sold worldwide to raise money and to remember those who lost their lives in conflicts and wars. And on the 11th of November, I will be parading with my colleagues from the Royal British Legion Thailand at the Remembrance Service in Kanchanaburi. The service is open to anyone, and last year I think we had in excess of 500 guests at the service. It's quite a big event, and if you've never been, I recommend trying to put it into your diary and at least do it once in your lifetime. It's quite an emotive experience. "255 British personnel lost their lives defending the Falklands, of whom 85 were Royal Navy. 124 were Army, 27 Royal Marines, 6 Merchant Navy and 4 Royal Fleet Auxiliary and 8 Hong Kong sailors. 3 of those lost were extremely close friends and shipmates of mine. Corporal Michael David Doc Love, Royal Marines, affectionately known as Doc. Nobody ever found out why. Haven't got a clue. He was a Royal Marine who cross-trained as an air crewman, and he was awarded posthumously the DSM for his actions in the Falklands. On the 19th of May 1982, Doc was crew of a Sea King helicopter that was transporting members of possibly the SAS and possibly some of the guys who were on South Georgia. When unfortunately a catastrophic engine failure took place, they think caused by a bird strike, but it's never been fully established, which made the aircraft crash into the sea, killing most of those on board, including Doc. His body was later recovered, and he was buried at sea, aged 22. Petty Officer Air Crewman Colin Paul Vickers. I knew Colin very early on in my flying career, and he was a bit like a sea daddy to me on a couple of occasions. Our friend and comrade Buck Ryan remembered being in the same mess as Colin at HMS Ganges when he was a young sailor, 1964. He says he fondly remembers his friend every day. On the 12th of June, Colin was one of 13 men who died aboard HMS Glamorgan when it was struck by an Exocet missile. They were buried at sea. Colin was 33. Petty Officer Air Crewman Kevin Stewart Casey. We fondly knew Kevin as Ben after the 1960s TV series Dr. Ben Casey. We go in for nicknames a lot in the services. He died the day after I got back safely to HMS Antrim. On the 23rd of April, Ben was on board a Sea King Mark IV helicopter carrying out routine cross-deck operations. It's not known why the aircraft crashed into the sea. Most were killed, but the pilot survived the crash. And mine and Ben's paths crossed often. We both started flying at the same time. We were both missile aimers at the same time. Both served on 772 Squadron. We were both on the same jungly operational course. And if I take you back to that image, Ben is the second from the left. Red Charland, the guy standing next to me, also died about 6 years ago. Nobody, again, knows why. The circumstances were fairly strange. Just a little note about Ben's widow, Ellie, and just to try and illustrate the fraternity that ex-servicemen or servicemen feel. Ellie was an ex-Wren and was and still is very close to our association, the Air Crewmen's Association. About 20 years after Ben's death, one of our air crewman buddies wanted to try and start a relationship with Ellie. Before he did anything, he asked every member of the association if they had a problem with it. This is why I wear my poppy. I would now ask if you could, those of you who can, if you can't manage it, I'd like you to be upstanding for about 2 minutes while I play a video of the last post from a remembrance service 2 years ago.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
go home, tell them of us, and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today.
And that concludes my presentation. Thank you all for your attention. And I'll be happy to take any questions if anybody wants to ask anything. Can't guarantee an answer though. Nope, good, I'll sit down then.
Just a quick question. Obviously it was a very challenging talk for you to give, and you put in enormous preparation time, I know. How do you feel now that you've given the talk?
I only really was able to start talking about the South Georgia incident about 2 or 3 years ago, and that was with the help of a very good friend of mine. And ever since then, it's been cathartic. It's helped me. It as you said, it's not easy.
Thank you, Roy. Absolutely fascinating talk. Lest we forget, you really brought it home in your own way. I spent 5 years in the Falklands after you brave lads cleared the way and many soldiers died. I understand it fully. But people will forget, unfortunately, and that was a superb reminder, your own situation, that we should not forget as long as we're still alive. Absolutely fascinating story. Thank you very much, Roy.
Hey, Roy, you don't get to beat your retreat that fast. You're not on a helicopter now. Come on up here. We've got a very small token of our deep, deep and genuine appreciation for you giving that talk.
Thanks very much.
So don't forget there's a poppy thing, buy a poppy flower before you leave today. And it's just one of these coincidental things.